Boom, I'm in the room. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Everyday Conversations regarding mental health. I've got a great guest on this evening. Now, you're watching because there's nothing on the telly. And I'm coming to you live from the old Heale Manor. Lord Heale, your host. Tonight, well, we're going to be having a chat about mental health and taking the stigma out of it. That's what the show's all about. Now, not forgetting Tuesday, don't forget Tuesdays over on the live stream Awesome Quiz channel. We have a quiz every Tuesday. If you miss the quizzes, you can always go back and do them afterwards. And all you need to do is just pop your scores in the old chat box. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a chat this evening with somebody across the pond up in Canada who served with the Canadian forces. And we're going to talk about how they look after their people regarding mental health. So without too much further ado, let me bring in my guest for this evening. Boom, you're in the room. Welcome, Julian.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, or should I say Lord Heale.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here tonight.
Got a certificate and everything.
Perfect.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about yourself and what your day job is and your reserve occupation.
Well, it's all the way back to being a young 17-year-old, unsure of what I was going to do with my life. I decided to join the Army Reserve, or I guess back in those days it would have been the Territorial Army for the British Army, and then I just sort of stayed on, and I retired probably, oh gosh, I guess it's almost 10 years ago. Retired as a Brigadier-General in the Canadian Army, but as a reservist, I had two lives. So I had a civilian career as well as a military career. As I like to say, I was almost schizophrenic in the sense of having to split my mind in two different directions simultaneously. So, or as we say in Canada, I had a foot on the shore and a foot in the canoe. So I lived both lives, since leaving the Army, I've been able to focus my attention solely on my civilian career, which is around managerial leadership in corporations. And I suppose a bit like the British Army, we tend here not to talk about our military careers, and it's not a big thing, not like in the United States. So I have a bit of an unusual career, and from that standpoint of having both had the experience of leading soldiers as well as actually then teaching leaders in organizations and businesses in the nature of leadership, or as I refer to, managerial leadership, which is sort of a combination of bringing management and leadership together, because you can't have one without the other. We tend to talk a lot about leadership, and certainly leadership is a critical one from the standpoint of mental well-being, but you also have to have the management practices in place in order to be truly effective. So so that's what I've focused my career on these days is managerial leadership. So
Boom. So I'm back.
the background, at any rate.
Yeah. So, Major General. Yeah, it's a bit far up the greasy old pole, isn't it?
Well, I didn't get quite that far. Only brigadier. So
Brigadier.
and we have leaves, and we've gone through all sorts of changes in our rank system. But as we say, a one leaf, as opposed to the Americans that say a one star. Whereas, of course, in the British Army, it's a brigadier as opposed to a Brigadier-General. So
Yeah.
it's
So,
slight differences, but very very
well,
common lineage.
yeah, but it makes a difference on the pension.
Well, it does, but as reservists, we don't get much of a pension, so I'm not. Hence, I've got to have another career, otherwise, I'll
Yeah.
be destitute on the streets. So.
So, from your military side of the life, then, so you signed up as a reserve way back when,
way
as a
back when.
boy, and so like the reserves or the territorials back then, you sort of turn up once a week and then or once or twice a month for a weekend. I guess that was the same as it is here, or used to be.
Absolutely.
They've changed it a lot nowadays. The reserves here tend to do an awful lot more than
Yeah, as do our reservists as well.
yeah,
It's no longer that, and the intent is to maintain the same standard of training, so that reservists can deploy on operations and the likes. So it does pull heavily on a young squattie's career, right? As because they're being pulled
absolutely.
in many different directions, whether it's family or whether it's work and the likes. And so it certainly does have an impact for sure.
I'm not sure what the effect is at the moment in Canada for recruiting, but it's a bit of a struggle here at the moment. During the Afghan years, it wasn't such a drama. There was
No,
always
exactly.
there's always a queue of lads queuing up to sort of come and do their 4 years and boys own adventure, get their medal and do their 4 years and leave. But we haven't actually got much of a war as such going on at the moment. So these guys aren't queuing up round the block to get in.
No, it is a serious problem, I think, throughout NATO right now around recruitment. I mean, the Americans are even struggling,
Yeah.
whereas it's part of their culture and the likes. And yeah, certainly during Afghanistan, we had troops flocking to the colors, that in great groups and great droves. But I think also the impact of COVID has also had a
Yeah.
had a bad impact on recruitment and society as a whole has changed, right? So
Yeah.
not everything changed in COVID, but everyone did, and attitudes and motivation and I would suggest as well there's a bit of a morale problem on this side of the ocean.
Hmm.
The cases of harassment and the likes have really dragged the Canadian military through the media frenzy that of course follows that, and that's having an impact on soldiers and their attitudes. So and which speaks again to mental
Yeah.
well-being. Like, do you value the job that you're in? Is
Absolutely.
a critical piece to mental well-being. So
I think I think one of the other things that we've suffered an awful lot from is lack of investment. Yes, they've thrown millions and millions of pounds at kit and stuff like that, but the basics of life they've neglected, like the state of quarters. Over here,
right.
we get military quarters when the guy gets married. He generally moves into an army quarter or a service quarter, and they've suffered from lack of investment, lack of maintenance for years, and all they do is firefight problems, and it's even worse in barracks.
Yeah.
Barracks, I mean, there's the first Sea Lord came and did a visit down here at HMS Collingwood, and they've closed the block down, accommodation
Well,
block, because it's it's not fit to live in.
yeah.
And I mean, and that's down to lack of investment, lack of maintenance, and lack of
Well,
money.
yeah, and it stems from the fact that the politicians
Yeah,
don't see the polls shifting. The public isn't perturbed, and so as a result, they're more concerned in other things. And
yeah,
so, no politician. Yes, we have parties that speak at great lengths about how we have to invest, but when it comes to the actual dollars and cents on our side, at any rate,
same here.
it's just not there. So and I think this in turn impacts on all our soldiers as well. It's
Yeah.
and we don't have the kit as well, so and we're
Uh,
you know we're turning over kit to Ukraine and the likes,
yeah.
and
We're
there's no
suffering from lack of
indication.
ammunition.
Yeah,
Giving
so
them all our ammunition, and our
well, and
ammunition factories are having to sort of work 24 hours a day to replenish the stock that we've given away.
yeah,
And then that has that knock-on effect that it damages morale. And
it
once you
does.
start damaging morale, then that starts having a negative effect on people's well-being.
It absolutely does, and yeah, and I would say that it's been sort of a perfect storm. So during the war in Afghanistan, we sort of had the impacts of full on trauma in the field, and then you come back, and then those that stayed in, and we lost a lot after Afghanistan. That sort of said,
Yeah.
I can't fit into this world back home, and so they left. And I'm not even talking to about those that actually struggled mentally yet. But then
Mm.
you have COVID, which essentially locked down the military, and then a lack of investment. And so, for those who are serving right now, I honestly believe it's a big challenge.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's very much an issue.
Yeah. I think that again we have a similar problem where guys come back off of their tour, they go out on their first exercise after being on a full on, I mean, conflict tour, and they get into an exercise, and it's not the same. You can't
No,
replicate
exactly.
what they've, and they get totally disillusioned, and they walk out the door. But a lot of them haven't dealt with their issues.
No,
It's
precisely.
only recently that we've got into doing TRIM, which is the trauma incident management, and that really has a good effect if it's done properly at the correct time. So after a traumatic incident, you go in sort of 72 hours later, and you
Right.
look at everybody that's gone through it, whatever the incident was, work out who needs what sort of care, whether they need an individual chat, whether they need a group chat, whether they need an overall brief, and you assess everybody. So I come back in at the 30-day point, see how people are getting on. It's not unusual to have some of the sleepless nights, the re going through the incident, but talking to your mates, etc. That all helps, and that's encouraged. And then you go back at the 3 month point and reassess everybody again. And at any time during that period, if people are really struggling, then they get moved on to professional help. By which time most people generally are okay. But that's only
Yeah,
been the last few years. The early days of the Afghan conflict, it wasn't heard of. The Marines have been doing it for about 20 odd years prior, but the field army hadn't. So it's only a fairly new thing that the field army's been involved in. But I think we're on a precipice of a tsunami of mental health issues. We're still getting veterans from the Falklands coming through having issues now. So what we're going to get in years to come, God only knows. And I guess
I think
that would be the same for all the units or all the countries that were involved in conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq, obviously. So,
yeah, I think in the Canadian experience, we've done a lot of peacekeeping, but we hadn't done any full out war. and we were caught flat-footed on this issue of mental health, and really struggled initially. I mean, there were lots of attempts initially, but the Afghan war certainly changed all that, and in turn that's fed trauma from our peacekeeping times as well. So
Yeah.
so that's bubbling to the surface, because there's another element in peacekeeping where you're witnessing what's going on, but you have no control over it, which just adds to the post-traumatic stress. So it's a very real thing. And in my spare time, I'm the vice chair of Wounded Warriors Canada, which started off as a charity to fund programming for, in particular, reservists. So in the early days of the Afghan War, our issue was that reservists would deploy with their regiment. And they'd go into the field and they'd be involved in the trauma, but then they'd come home and they would not be on a home station of a battalion where they were amongst all their friends. In fact, they would just disappear into their basements with a large wad of cash from their experience. And so initially, we started working at Wounded Warriors with reservists, but then it became clear that everyone was struggling, and so our focus is not just on the veterans themselves, but also their families.
Mm.
You can help someone to recover from a traumatic incident, but and then they get sort of fixed up, I suppose, as best one can. But then they go back, and their families are still left in that moment of when dad or mom left, and so we've found that we've had to broaden it out to the families, and particularly young kids who've now witnessed their parents. And if you have two parents who are serving at the same time, it makes it even worse.
Yeah.
So that's been our efforts. And we're no longer funding someone else's programs. We've focused on realizing that you really need trauma-informed experts. You need psychologists rather than just getting together and going on a fishing trip
Yeah.
and drinking lots of booze. That doesn't help in the
No.
long run. You really need the trauma-informed experts to be able to help those individuals. So that's where we focused our energy. But it's huge, and the other piece now is not just the recovery, but it's the resiliency.
Yeah.
So we run a number of programs around resiliency, so that before you get into the situation, so that you understand the nature of stress and what it does to you. So.
Mm.
And it's
Well,
it's also overcoming that warrior ethos is the tricky part as well. Like,
yeah.
so keep your mouth shut, and this sort of and soldier on kind of thing, and that stoicism that so many of us have been had bred into us doesn't help in the long
Doesn't
run.
help at all. Um,
Yeah,
and I think what you picked up on the individuals that deploy, an awful lot of guys for us, particularly the reserves, deploy out as individual augmentees. So they get mobilised, they deploy out, they get assigned to a unit, they do the 6 months with them, they come back, they're demobilised, and they're left to go home. And a lot of the time they miss going through the decompression. And this is something that they found recently that's come to light with the Falklands, where the guys who were flown back early, they suffered more than the guys that came back on the ships, because the
right.
guys that came back on the ships, it's like 2 or 3 weeks to come back on the ship, and that they were allowed to have a couple of cans a day, and they could talk about and take the mickey and do all of that good stuff, which was effectively decompressing them. They were able to talk about the experience that they've been through, whereas the guys that were flown back to a hero's welcome Bryce Norton or Lynham when they flew back into, didn't get that. And years on, it's those guys that have been suffering, a lot of them in silence, because of that ethos that we used to have of you didn't talk about how you were feeling.
Right.
And nowadays, I think the education piece that it's still a problem, trying to get guys to talk about how they feel. And it's okay not to be okay, but it's trying to get that across to say that you're not weak if you are having problems. If you are struggling with your mental well-being, then it's okay to talk about it. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do, particularly with this channel, is to take the stigma out of the mental well-being piece, and to let people know that if they are struggling, there is help. And if we can help just one person from each program, then we're going an awful long way to helping lots of people.
No, it's so true. And that stigma is so prevalent. Again, it goes back to that nature of stoicism and stiff upper lip and all that sort of stuff that that I guess we inherited from the British Army at any rate. And but I think it's part of the ethos. It's part of the profession of arms. And recognizing that you need to ask for help. There's an overused analogy. I really hate it, but I'm going to use it anyway. And it's that you have to put your mask on the aircraft before you put the mask on anybody else, right? So you have to take care of yourself first.
Absolutely.
And because you won't be of any help to anybody else. So recognizing that this is a very real thing. It's not a form of weakness. It's none of those things. It's just the nature of how we deal with stress, how our bodies deal with stress. And it's a huge issue. And your point around the decompression point was we had the same problems in Afghanistan initially with decompression, and the psychologists would be waiting for the aircraft to arrive. And if you want to get help, go over and talk to that one over there. And the troops would just want to get home. They didn't want to go and talk. They didn't want to get delayed in any way. So, there was no way that anybody
that was the problem with it. I mean, that was the biggest problem with decompression, is that, it's a great idea they used to fly us into Cyprus, for about 3 days, where you could sort of lounge around on the beach, have a few beers, and nobody wanted to do it really, and everybody had to answer this questionnaire, how are you feeling and all that. Yeah, I'm fine.
Exactly.
And as soon as they get back into Blighty, boom, they all they were interested in is getting home, and everybody. Everybody to a man just said when they got asked the questions, because everybody got asked the questions when they went through demobilisation or whatever, when they got back, and they said, yeah, we're fine. I just want to go home, because they know if they say that they weren't okay, they would be there for at least another 24 hours.
Exactly.
So and they couldn't. I mean, the powers that be, I don't think saw that happening. No. They thought, yeah, people are fine, when people weren't.
Exactly.
But they really needed to come up with a better way of dealing with it at the end of your tour, where people, all they cared about is that they got through whatever they've been through on the tour, and they just wanted to get home. And then that brings in another problem. Once people get home, that's when some problems really start, is trying to fit back in. For me personally, my late wife, bless her soul, I'd be away for 6 months, I'll come back and I came back one time, I walked in, I had to walk out again, check the number on the house. I thought I'd walked into the wrong house. Everything had changed downstairs. Doors,
Right.
walls moved, new kitchen, everything. But after being about 10 minutes inside the house, it was like I'd never been away.
Right.
But she was so used to that.
Right.
Whereas an awful lot of people just didn't, just don't cope with being away for 6 months, coming back into an environment where the wife or the partner has been running the whole show. The kids have had 6 months of growing up without seeing the parent. And it works both ways, male and female, because I deployed out with a girl that had two kids. She deployed out with us. A partner looked after them and a no pair. And then she came back. So lots of others had that same problem. So trying to fit back in after somebody's been in charge of the remote for 6 months and you're trying
Yeah.
to muscle back in and get the remote off of her. And that's when the problems can really start. And that's why so many relationships tend to break down, because they don't have that understanding. They don't have that, and you can't talk to them about it either, because they just don't understand, unless it's been a service family that both parents are deployed
Right.
out.
Yeah.
Then they can have a conversation. But for people that haven't, the most partners just don't understand what somebody's been through, particularly if it's been somebody like an infantry soldier on the front line, trying to explain what you've been through, what you've seen in that 6 months. They just wouldn't understand.
No, and that's why peer-to-peer programs are so important. That you have to be able to speak a common language.
Yeah,
But that was initially the difficulty when we first started with family work is that
yeah,
you had to be able to create that environment. But when you create the environment where you bring families together so that there's actually a shared environment
yeah,
where the spouse or the significant other or whatever the case may be, sees that, oh, they've actually struggled with the same things that I've struggled with.
yeah.
It
No.
really does help.
We've got some
You know,
comments
it,
coming in, by the way. So let's just pull
oh,
the
okay.
comments up. There we go. Evening, Keith. We've got Keith Eagle VP saying good evening to us. And Jackie, hello, darling. Love you to bits. So very interesting, Tim. I understand all what is being discussed because I saw it firsthand with Alan. Also, the children lived through it as well. Sad days until he was taken away, the wings of combat stress. Yeah, Alan was a really, I mean, one of my closest mates. We've been through a lot together. He was my section commander back in 1976, and we went through Northern Ireland together. He was shot in Northern Ireland, and Jackie, his wife, she was a welfare officer in the battalion, so she saw an awful lot of it as
Right.
well coming through. So she understands.
Yeah, well, it has this knock-on effect. The whole thing has a knock-on effect. So
Yeah,
we have to get past the stigma so that people are actually willing to discuss this and recognize that we spend a lot of time and energy focusing on our physical health, right? We go to the
mm,
doctor all the time, and we go and we get our blood taken and we get all those sort of things, but we don't realize the interrelationship of our mind and our body, and that it's equally important to get that mental checkup from the
yeah,
neck up, as they say, right? I mean, that's so
absolutely.
critical.
I think
and
that's
and
one.
otherwise we just end up creating this society that our kids now have had to live through,
Yeah,
and then how is that going to impact them in the future, and our society continues. So the There are lots of efforts, though. I have to admit, there are lots of efforts to try and remove the stigma as much as
Yeah.
possible.
I
And
mean, if you put it into the analogy of psychological operations,
right,
with artillery, you fire a shell and you can see an effect immediately. You go into a psychological operations campaign and it's very, very difficult to see results, to see an impact, to see to get a measure of effect. You get somebody that's blown up by a bomb, you can see immediately that they've got a limb missing.
right.
The people that are surrounding them, that are helping them, you don't see what's going on inside their head. And it's not until sometime later that starts coming to the fore. So the measure of effect of what's happened in a traumatic incident may take years to come out. But it could come out earlier if it's talked about. If people are struggling, they need to start talking about it. The sooner they can talk about it, the easier it'll become to deal with.
Yeah, and on this side of the ocean, our Wounded Warriors programs have now expanded into the first responder community. So fire, police,
Yeah,
ambulance, actually anybody in uniform, whether it's Coast Guard or corrections officers or any of those roles, because they've got no support either. They've had no support. Actually, the military's better off than these communities, and they're having the same issues because they're having traumatic events, and then they're
yeah,
going back into a workplace. A big issue these days is what we refer to as sanctuary trauma, where I suffer my trauma, and I suppose, Tim, we were really talking about it earlier. I suffer
mm,
my trauma. I go back into an organization where I'm supposed to have sanctuary, and the systems and processes actually make it worse. And
yeah,
so we have to look at this whole thing holistically and care for everyone in a much more holistic manner, because it will impact us for decades to come,
mm,
and it's impacting every day. And
yeah,
unfortunately, those that don't get the support and don't get the care, that then you have the other extreme where they take their own lives, and that's we can't continue at this rate. It's just
mm,
it's ridiculous. So it's a very messy situation, but I'm sure if you think back, things are getting better. We had no clue on this side of the ocean what we were getting into in Afghanistan. Hadn't
mm.
been in war in a very long time, and not since Korea actually. So we were learning afresh, and the mad scramble was on. But
Yeah.
it's
I
truly
guess
focused.
the British Army were slightly better off, where we had 30 odd years in Northern Ireland
Right.
fighting a guerrilla operation, pretty much. People said it wasn't a war, but when you're out there patrolling the streets, it certainly felt pretty horrible. Um, and
Trauma is
then,
trauma is trauma. It doesn't,
absolutely,
and no one person's trauma is worse than someone else's. Like, we
that's it.
can't compare and say, well, my trauma is less, so I shouldn't have to worry. I shouldn't be affected by this. It affects us all differently.
It certainly does. I mean, we were fortunate that we had the first Gulf War. We had the Balkans, all those years that we spent in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Kosovo. So we've seen an awful lot of conflict, although it was deemed peacekeeping. By the time we got into Afghanistan in '02, then it was it benign? It was. We were welcomed with fairly much open arms when we came into Kabul. But I got there in the early 2002 and left in the June. But it wasn't until we took the eye off the ball, turned our attention to Iraq in 2003-4, that Afghanistan then turned ugly, and then when we got into Helmand Province, it turned really nasty. The initial in 2006, we were involved most of the times in a shootout with the Taliban, and it wasn't until about sort of 2007, 2008 that they started planting an awful lot of IEDs, and that brought in a whole world of pain for lots and lots of people. And that's what we've now going to be dealing with for an awful long time to come.
Well, and just as a sidebar to all of that, the collapse of Afghanistan and the collapse of our efforts in Afghanistan, I think, has just fueled things all the more. So, that old 60s tune, what the hell am I fighting for, suddenly comes to the forefront. So, and will continue to impact. So again, it's about get out and get the services, get the help now. When you have the opportunity, it's and utilizing all those services that are out there, so important.
I know one of the things that affected me was that chaos 18 months ago when Biden pulled his troops out, and we couldn't generate enough other countries to help us stabilise it, and the whole thing collapsed. And 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan was actually for nothing,
Right.
because the Taliban have come back in, and the lives of the locals there are miserable. I mean, girls aren't allowed to go to school, boys can't go to school. They and locals, I've had it firsthand. I've got Afghan friends that have managed to get out, and they were telling us what it was like under the Taliban when they took over again, and they were actively seeking them to, and they're still going around killing people every day, and it's just not on the news because nobody's in there telling it, and for me that was a real frustration, because I'd spent so much time there. It really hurts the way it happened, that we got dragged out, and I'm still feel angry about it.
No, and rightly so, and
But the amount of lives that have changed, the amount of guys that we lost there, the amount of injuries. We got guys walking around limbless. Was it all for nothing? That's that's the sort of questions that they're asking, and that is having that knock-on effect against people's mental well-being. And I'm sure your guys are doing exactly the same.
Oh, absolutely. It's again, it's the nature of it all, but sort of recognizing that this is another form of trauma. I mean, seeing those shots, seeing that footage, on the daily news, just adds to the trauma. So again, it's get the help to help you through this, rather than sitting and screaming at your television set. It's absolutely critical, because there will be this will continue. This will continue, as as the comment from Eagle VP there. Humans never learn. It's very true.
And that is a problem. We just never learn. I mean, we've got that conflict going on at the moment in Ukraine. Are we going to get dragged into it? Are we going to get dragged into another war with them? Are we going to get dragged into a war with China over Taiwan?
It's very challenging times for the world right now.
It is. Not to mention the Middle East. I mean, that's always having conflict down there, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's going on down in Sudan at the moment is not really being publicised at all. Aden, that part of the world, Somalia, is still a hotbed of dramas. The Middle East are coming through the Straits of Hormuz. We got ships down there, escort duties, trying to ensure the tankers don't get hijacked. They have to be so careful that they don't get captured by the Iranians. So it's a nightmare, and this is all going on all the time, and it's affecting people's mental well-being. And we haven't got the resources in place to be able to help deal with it.
Yes.
Um,
Our societies are all struggling on the mental well-being. I mean, so it is just continuing to pile on, and whether that's the effects of media or social media, it will continue to be there. So again, it does come back to, get the help in recovery and help to build the resilience for the changes that are yet to come, because we can hope that we inspired a generation by the sacrifice in Afghanistan, but that there was good, but recognizing that we have to take care of ourselves first. So.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier about suicide. I mean, lockdown didn't help anybody at all.
Yeah.
And the amount of veterans that are taking their own lives at the moment is unprecedented, along with children. I mean, lots of people don't realise the amount of young kids, young teenagers that are taking their own lives. And then you've got the farmers. I mean, farmers have always had trouble, isolation. They tend to be high on the suicide rates. So there's not an awful lot of help for people that are determined to do it. Those that are determined to do it, you won't know until they've done it and they've got it right. Somebody that's tempted to do it, then generally it's a cry for help.
Yes.
But what we can say is that there is always help out there. You only need to ask. And it's okay not to be okay. And if you do find yourself struggling at all and don't know where to turn, first place to turn is to a friend or a stranger even, or your doctor. Start with a doctor. And if a doctor offers you pills to start with, decline them. There are better ways than taking medication. Yeah. And there are groups out there, particularly for veterans. There are lots and lots of veterans groups out there. And you only need to do a very quick search on the internet and you can find a group near to where you live that will help.
We're raised in the army to have a battle buddy, right? So reach out to your battle buddy. Reach out to those people that you can talk to, that know the experiences. Just check in. And for those that are not necessarily suffering, check in on everybody else. Stay engaged. Human beings have to stay engaged and you have to have that connection. And so it's absolutely mission critical from that standpoint.
So, Julian, have you got any final words to say to anybody that is out there struggling?
Well, it is, final words. I guess what I would say is this is the nature of the human condition. It's not about being a Superman or a Superwoman. It's about that this is the reality that our bodies go through, the general adaptive syndrome, the simple fact that you burn energy to deal with these things, and then eventually your body can't handle it any longer. And that you've got to realize that this is a reality, and that get yourself some help. Don't suffer in silence. It's and as we talk about in the military, it's about force protection, right? So it's about protecting yourself. first and foremost, and getting yourself the help that you need, and along the way you'll be helping others.
Yeah, couldn't have put it better myself. So, Julian, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Tim, for the opportunity. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been a great conversation.
It's been a fantastic conversation. So if you'd like to hang around for a minute, we'll just have a quick wash up afterwards.
Okay. Absolutely. A hot wash.
So boom, there you go. That's another Everyday Conversations regarding mental health dealt with for another week. Hopefully you've got something from it. Hopefully, if you know somebody that's struggling a little bit, go and have a chat with them. Sidle up and say, "You all right, mate?" And if they are, they'll say, "Yeah, I'm all right." No, are you really all right? But if you're going to do that, make sure you've got the time to listen to them. There's nothing worse than somebody that starts to open up and say, "Oh, sorry, mate, I've got to bugger off now." You leave them in a state of limbo. If you're going to ask that question, make sure you've got time to listen. And sometimes that's all it takes. Use your 2 ears as much as, or twice as much as you use your cake hole, and that's where it goes. So thank you everybody else out there. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Keith. I'll catch up with you all in a bit. Love to all, and until next week, don't forget, we'll be live again next week at 7 o'clock, British summertime. So until then, TTFN. Ta-ta for now.